All right, so we'll just do a quick intros and then we'll kick off. So I'm Chloe, I'm an Associate Director at Think's Insight and Strategy. I've got a background in public engagement, particularly deliberative engagement, but also kind of theory-led evaluation and more general qual.
My name's Sylvie. I'm the Head of Public Attitudes at the Responsible Technology Adoption Unit, which is a team within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And we engage with the public to understand attitudes towards data-driven technology, including AI, so that we can ensure that policy interventions reflect those public values. And prior to working in government, I was a social researcher at Ipsos.
Thanks. I'm Lucy. I am a partner at Think's, working with Chloe. I've also worked with the team at RTA, formerly CDI, over the last few years on a kind of framework contract, delivering a whole range of different public attitudes projects on different aspects of AI, technology and data use, particularly in relation to the public sector. As well as a kind of long history of engaging the public through public dialogue, public engagement and deliberation on usually quite upstream technology issues. So that's kind of where I come at this question from, having talked to people about technology in the abstract and now thinking about AI in this context of research.
Lovely. All right, we're going to do this in three parts. We'll start by just giving you a sense of who we are and kind of where we're coming in at, really. So in terms of how the insights industry is shaping the impact of AI on knowledge creation, just to give you a bit of a sense of what we've observed in the insights industry or how government, in terms of how it's using it or isn't, and what we're kind of excited about, what we're wary of in terms of how AI might be used. So I think for me, I think using AI to generate ideas and STEM design and that kind of thing is great, really useful. Saving time on tasks like quality assessing open-end survey responses, transcription, all that kind of stuff is really great so long as it's kind of accurate and checked. Facial coding and voice analytics used to really interest me, but in practice, I think that what you get for your money isn't really that sophisticated. A few numbers about sentiment isn't that helpful at a kind of small qualitative scale. That only becomes kind of interesting and helpful at a larger scale. I can see that Joe is smiling with my own eyes, and I don't need lots of expensive numbers to tell me that. I think the survey chatbots and video avatars are a bit weird, and I'm kind of yet to be convinced by that, but I think it can be more engaging for people too. It kind of depends the quality, really. But I think what's very interesting and what I'm not sure of yet is the kind of use in analysis and reporting. So I kind of worry that there might be kind of unchecked inaccuracies or misinterpretation. I'm worried that staff might not develop those key skills that you need, and perhaps part of it's because I like to think that I'm very special with my special skills, and I don't want a machine to be good at the thing that I do. And so I'm just kind of reduced to finding the right framing. So I think maybe analysis and reporting is, if you want to knock out some quick headlines overnight and do a quick thematic report, fine. But I think the more nuanced stuff I'm yet to be kind of convinced by. What about you guys?
So I think across lots of the public attitudes research that we've conducted, we see a really clear sense from the public that they want AI to be used in a way that really augments human skills and capabilities rather than replaces those. And from my experience of using AI in research, I think that's very much the space that we're in. It really feels like AI is a partner in knowledge creation rather than doing the knowledge creation itself at the moment. So, like as Chloe suggested, AI is really useful for structuring data, for doing an initial run through data to identify some of those really high-level topics and themes, but it still feels like there's a huge role for the researcher in order to apply their expertise, apply context and their research skills in order to really draw out those very nuanced insights. So it certainly doesn't feel like AI is a silver bullet at the moment. It can't develop and create that knowledge itself. However, I do think we might see that change as we go forward. AI is clearly becoming more capable. Who knows how this trajectory will continue, but it's likely it will continue somewhat. So we may get to a point where AI can create knowledge in its own right, and at that point, it may come to a point where we want to think about drawing lines. as has been kind of mentioned in some of the earlier conversations, are there certain tasks that we actually want to reserve for researchers, whether that's to preserve research quality or because it's for the benefit of researchers or for the benefit of participants, because that's where actually that human input is really important, or because those are skills that we think it's important that researchers preserve. So I think that will raise a lot of questions, although it's also quite exciting.
Thanks, Sylvie. I think, I think that sort of the two things that I'm interested in thinking about how we apply AI in research currently. One is, what is our baseline? So what are we comparing AI research tools against? And I think that if you think back to the beginning of the pandemic when we talked about taking research online, for those of us who work face-to-face, I remember having those conversations about, well, it'll be less inclusive or it'll be less accessible, and thinking, well, hang on, what we were doing before wasn't perfectly inclusive or perfectly accessible either. When you meet people in a room, you limit access to people who are able to do that. I think with AI, there's a sort of similar question, which is not does AI meet a kind of perfect standard for delivering a particular research function or service, but how does it compare with the baseline level that we're achieving through human research? And I think that when we start to understand what that baseline is, what we will get to, I think, is a better sense of where AI introduces different biases, different risks, different quality issues, rather than just introducing new ones. I think that's something that we're still grappling with a little bit when we're looking at the kinds of tools that are available to us. The other thing, and I think we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, particularly when you're thinking about social and government research, which is my practice, is the issue of intent. So we as researchers approach our work with intent. We have an ethical orientation towards the research that we're doing. Whether we examine it or not, it's there. And I think the question of what an AI tool that is interviewing a participant or analysing data, even transcribing, there's more mechanical tools, it's less of an issue. But when we get into that question of knowledge generation, as Sylvie says, then how do we think about the intent which is coded into a machine system, and how does that compare with the intent of a human researcher? And that's sort of the question I think is interesting to me, beyond that quality point of, are we getting a thing that is better or just differently good?
Awesome. All right, we'll get into, you've got a bit of a sense of who we are. We'll get into the kind of meat of things. We've each done kind of several pieces of work around public views on the use of AI, including a couple of projects together. One of our reports is locked into the comms grid, and we thought it would be out by now. It isn't. It will be published soon. We were going to talk about that. We'll talk kind of generally about a few things that we've kind of worked on. So I think if we focus on what do we find to be the kind of most striking and consistent findings.
Yep. So I think thinking about AI in the public sector, which is obviously coming from a government perspective, one of the things we're interested in, we see quite a lot of openness, perhaps surprisingly, among the public to the use of AI in the public sector. And this is across a range of different uses, so whether that's healthcare, education, or policing. How people can kind of see how it can increase efficiency and how it can improve outcomes. They can see the potential for that, which is really positive. However, as is often the case in research, the devil really is in the detail. And what we see is that even within those different sectors, attitudes vary hugely depending on the specific use case. So, for example, in education, we see quite different attitudes towards AI being used to mark homework or say, maths homework than we do English homework. So, there really is a lot of nuance. And when we speak to the public, they can really unpick this. I think one of the things that comes out and is constantly amazing as a researcher is how you can go to the public, people walk in and say, I don't know anything about AI, I don't even know what it stands for, I'm not going to have anything to say. And then 20 minutes into the conversation, they're coming up with these really nuanced, detailed insights, which are so helpful and useful, and it just really reinforces the value of public attitudes research on these complex topics. So attitudes vary by these specific use cases, but what we see are certain patterns that emerge about what the public want to see. So one of the first things is accuracy. People really aren't happy with AI being used if it's not going to be consistently accurate. And the benchmarks set for AI are quite often higher than are set for humans. So that's kind of the number one thing that comes out frequently. Transparency is also super important. So both in terms of the fact that AI is being used at all, that needs to be really transparent, but also how it's being used. If there are certain outcomes or decisions that are being made from the AI, what is the process and what is the data that is being used to inform those? And I think this feeds into the importance of accountability, and people want to be able to question and challenge any decisions or outcomes as a result of AI. And to do that, people feel like they need to understand a bit about how those decisions are being made, which is obviously sometimes a bit of a challenge when it comes to AI, because often even the people who create the AI don't quite know how those decisions are being made. And then finally, we see throughout that there needs to be a really clearly articulated tangible benefit for individuals. So not at a societal level, that doesn't seem to resonate. It really needs to be a benefit at the individual level. And what we tend to find is that the risks seem to be far more salient and immediate than the benefits. So this is something that people often really struggle with. And it tends to feed into a sense of risk aversion, which is something that we've seen really, really pick up over the last year or so, as you can all imagine, I'm sure. When we speak to the public, there is this overarching sense of risk aversion, which means that it can be quite hard for them to see what those benefits are. So I think, as researchers, one of the takeaways is that it's really important, if we are using AI in our research, to be able to really articulate what the benefit of that AI use is for individuals. It's not really enough just to say that it's efficient. What does that efficiency mean for the individual who's taking part in the research? Does it mean that the research is going to have a greater impact? Does it mean it's going to be a more timely impact? That needs to be articulated quite powerfully, I think.
Yeah, I think reflecting how do we ethically consent people to take part in research that involves AI tools? What needs to be different? I think there are questions for us to consider, and it's different depending on the functions. As you said, the public have very different attitudes to specific use cases. In the same way that people might have different expectations of their experience as a research participant, depending on whether it's product research, it's social research, it's policy research, it's health research. People's expectations are different, and our responsibilities can be different depending on the sensitivity of the topic. In the same way, I think there's a requirement for us as researchers to consider what are the specifics of the AI applications that we're using. I think the one kind of caveat or reflection that I'd have, having spent a lot of time talking to the public about AI, is that our behaviours and our attitudes in the abstract are not the same. So we've seen this in lots of work that we've done together, Sylvie. People will say, oh, I'm really cautious about my data, I feel really anxious about giving information to apps, to different services. Then you ask them what they've got on their phone, and they can give you a list of 15 different things that they're using, all of which use machine learning and algorithms to turn their personal data into value add for a corporation. And what's happening, I think, is that there are sort of some abstract and in principle concerns which are valid. I'm not disputing that those are valid, but there's also a sort of transactional thing that people are doing behaviourally, where if that benefit is clear and individual and tangible, then they're prepared to set aside those concerns. It's a bit like the thing where you get people who say, oh, absolutely can't use a smartphone, won't learn to do it until it lets them do something they really value, like FaceTiming their grandkids. And you know, the benefit and risk trade-offs, they're different things. The things that people value and the things that they're concerned about, as you said, are not kind of equal. So to what extent do we as researchers have a responsibility to make some of those values or risks transparent to people? As research participants, transparent to our clients, as buyers of research, but also just for ourselves as researchers with that kind of role of maintaining the integrity of what we're doing.
I think the things that I found most striking kind of align with some of the stuff that you've already been saying. I think people definitely are very wary and very worried about AI, particularly those that feel like they don't know very much about it, which is most people. I think I got the sense that people want to build slowly towards something that's beneficial and not kind of jump straight in. I think something I found the most striking that I'd love to hear kind of more views on it. There were quite radical ideas coming through around kind of addressing inequality and sharing the profits from AI, wanting kind of targeted and restricted use rather than a kind of consumer convenience frenzy. So like what they'll say is that they don't want that kind of thing. But then in practice, we know that people do take the convenient option. So there's something to wrestle with there. And I know you do a lot around technology, probably more than me. Are you finding that's quite consistent?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are. I think that there are sort of two realms in which people think about technology. There's the abstract, when we think about something called AI and what its implications are for a society, and then there's the realm of action and behaviour, in which we think about, is that app useful to me? Does that perform a function? You get people who are highly concerned about surveillance and privacy, who have Ring doorbells because they perform a specific function which they value. So I think that's a real, and that's true across all kinds of different technology applications, from work on drones, for example. People can see an individual benefit, but they're concerned about the societal level benefits. And those two things, I don't think that one is right and wrong. It's not like people are having these abstract concerns and we should discount them because they don't behave in line with them. Like that's not the value judgment I think we should make. But I do think that we have to sort of interrogate what is the mediation between those? To what extent do we, when we're using these tools, provide some of that kind of connection between what people say that they want at a societal level and how they act individually?
That is a conversation that I'd really want to have with the public, is to kind of tell them more about behavioural science and try and unpack it with them, rather than kind of make these kind of decisions in closed rooms. I suppose we've gotten to this much quicker than we did in our various Teams calls. But I think if we focus on our kind of last section, like how do we think that the views of the public should be factored in to the use of AI in research, particularly for the public sector, because that tends to be where we all sit. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. And maybe it'd be interesting to get views from the room. Do you, as researchers, when you are researching, do your participants know whether or not you're using AI tools? Can I do?
You can do whatever you like.
Yeah, okay. Hands up if you tell people when they take part in your research whether there's any AI tools involved. Okay. And are the other people not putting their hands up because they're not using any AI tools? Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, my question was poorly framed for a show of hands. But yeah, so I think that's interesting. And I suppose we can tell people these things, but are we telling them in the same way that cookies tell people how their data will be used? Right, because we also know from research that we do that nobody reads the cookies. Like very, very few people read the cookies. So I suppose that question of like how do we operationalize consent when we're talking about AI tools is interesting. To what extent is that something that we should feel obligated to do, and to do in a more meaningful way? Again, what's that baseline? To what extent do people really think about the data privacy information that we give them as research participants? Is it different? Is there some reason why, specifically when we're using an AI tool, we need to work harder on consent? Or is it just generally that we need to work harder on our consenting processes as a whole? And I think that to Sylvia's point earlier about context, that's hugely important. So if you are taking part in some product research where your expectation is that you as a research participant say some things and you hear nothing back, that feels quite different to a sort of social research project, maybe where you're working with service users who have a certain expectation that relationship between them and the commissioning body and the researcher has a different character. And that's probably, I think, where I would come back to the idea of intent and what's the intent of the researcher in the context. Do people need to feel confident that AI tools are being used in ways that are consistent with their expectations of the research relationship? And those expectations, I think, probably are different for public sector research. And they are particularly different. A lot of what I do and what Chloe does, we sort of straddle the line between research and public engagement. And I think once you move to that side, to the engagement end of the spectrum, where what you're doing is partly about kind of enacting the interaction between state and individual, the expectations there again might be different. And those expectations might not be stated because people don't necessarily know what they don't want until it happens. We always say people can tell you, like, bad news travels faster. this is also true with AI. The people might not object to something in principle until the bad thing happens, is that reported in the news becomes salient, at which point those expectations are clarified only in the negative, in the sense that an expectation which was not stated has failed to be met. So how do we understand those and plan for them and mitigate for them as researchers before we get to the point at which we have used a tool that is effective and efficient and useful, but has inadvertently either delivered an outcome which is not acceptable to people, or is perceived to be working in a way which is not in line with that relationship between the researcher and the researched?
I think, yeah, we've definitely talked about there's a big difference that I've heard from the public between what they expect from the public sector and what they expect from the private sector. There's a real sense of the social contract with government. People have expectations of the public sector to kind of behave carefully and ethically and kind of rein in the private sector that they don't tend to trust as much to have their best interests at heart. And I think that does change the context in terms of what people expect from researchers. Like, research for public sector is generally seen as, and I think by most people involved, including the participants, as trying to improve lives in some way by improving policies. And so there's a kind of value placed on the respect that is shown for stories, whereas in a private sector setting where you're kind of selling a product and trying to find out what people like, there might be different kinds of expectations there. So I think, yeah, context is definitely a big part of what we do with all this.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's as clean as that, like, public-private sector split. We actually see, like, attitudes towards, for example, data used by the public and private sector aren't clean-cut. There's a lot of, like, trust placed in private sector organisations, or low trust placed in public sector organisations in some cases. But yeah, it's the context, isn't it? It's what the data has been used for. So I've worked on research studies in the past when I was at an agency, which have collected really, really sensitive data on a really large scale. And in order to have the, like, impact that we needed within the timescales that were necessary, we did use AI to do that kind of first layer of analysis. And that was quite a hard message to give participants, because they were really kind of giving us their heart and soul and sharing really sensitive information. And there was a certain kind of contract between the researcher and the participant there, and the participant was really, like, investing in the research. And the idea that it wasn't necessarily a human who was going to read their response, like, didn't sit well. So that was where it was really important to have that message around, like, the reason that we're doing this is so that actually, like, we can hear really diverse voices, and that we can ensure that this research is on a scale that is going to mean that it is going to have an impact. And also the fact that the way that we were working, and the way that I think lots of people still are working, is really a partnership between AI and the human researcher. It's not that AI is doing the job for us, it's that they're making our job easier by doing the initial structure of that data, like, which comes back to that point around messaging again. And I suppose it is just respecting the time and the stories and the kind of, like, emotion that participants are putting into some of those kind of more serious topics that we research.
I think that's right. I think this a different way of thinking about this is there's partly a sort of, on the surface, it's the expectation that a person will hear their story. But I also think there's an expectation that a person will not just hear their story and process it in the sense that we process data as researchers, but that it will be felt or heard in the sense of it being part of a kind of human connection. I don't think we should overstate that, but I do think that it is relevant to the contract between researcher and individual. It's one of the real challenges across AI. I was talking earlier about that I work across a range of technology options. One of the big challenges when it comes to things like self-driving cars, which use AI and machine learning, is that in our legal system is based partially on intent. We have murder and we have manslaughter, and the difference between those is intent. So one of the big questions for AI broadly is, how do we deal with that issue of intent? We've got harm is one thing that we can measure, but intent is not the same. And if we put that into the context of research, what is the intent of the systems that we use? Well, they don't have intent in the same way that we as researchers might. Our ethical orientation is part of that intent that we have, particularly in the context of sensitive topics, of things where there's that expectation that there's a human involved.
I think it comes down to accountability, doesn't it? Like, what we were hearing is that people were nervous about decision. You know, research informs decisions, and if decisions are made based on inaccurate analysis. That's what people are worried about. But there's also a kind of accountability factor. Who are we going to hold accountable if this decision is incorrect? So I think those are some of the main things that came through. And with a whole 30 seconds before we throw it out to questions, if you were going to wrap up maybe just one key takeaway or one key question, what would it be?
I think, like we've talked about lots of important factors that need to be considered, both in terms of AI, but also really applicable to us as researchers, like transparency, accuracy, that kind of contract between the researcher and the participant. And I actually think that as researchers, we all have a really good basis for making these sorts of judgments. Like, we all abide by various ethical frameworks. We all understand research best practice, how to avoid harm to participants. And I don't think we need to throw out the rule book. I think lots of the tools that we've already been using throughout our careers can be tailored and applied to the use of AI. So I actually think that there is a really good foundation that just needs to be kind of built upon and is being built upon by lots of organisations to expand those ethical frameworks to cover AI.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, I guess the thing I would wrap up with is that, as Sylvie says, we have those frameworks in place. We do need to think about what AI means for them, but not to over-egg it. Right? We already have, we need to be clear about we have differential processes for consenting people to take part in research based on the context, based on the subject, based on the methods. I think AI is just one more thing in that. I guess I would reiterate that question around what is the kind of baseline that we're assessing against, and what are the sort of incentives for AI tools to function? Is there a risk that we create situations in which they generate insights that are welcome, or that are that we set up machine learning systems to deliver insights that are as expected or are palatable? Like, what's the role in the kind of, are the tools that we have currently able to help us understand the unexpected?
Nice.
I don't know the answer to that, but I'd be interested.
Cool. And we'll leave it there and throw it open to questions if anybody has any. You can keep talking if you don't. Yeah, go for it. Is it on its way? Cool.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for speaking, all of you. I was wondering if you had any thoughts around whether generative AI might widen the divide in digital inclusion and increase digital exclusion, and how we go about anticipating and mitigating this.
That's a great question, yeah. And yeah, absolutely. I think that AI tools, I mean, it's interesting, some of the AI tools that we're using, depending how we use them, as Sylvie said, we can use AI to support larger scale qual. Those are kind of interesting ways in which we can piece the two things together. So if saving budget by using some kinds of generative AI tools supports you putting more of it into your inclusion budget, brilliant. I think there's a way that there's a win-win there. I think there is a risk, however, that we increasingly become more digital and therefore exclude more voices just by virtue of that kind of issue of access. Even before you get into the issues of kind of generative AI and what models are trained on and those sorts of built-in biases, which I know, Sylvie, you've thought about.
Yeah, I think
a lot.
Yeah, I think there's you can think about it in two ways. So in terms of conducting research, we would consider digital exclusion like when we're doing a normal research study, for example. If we've increasingly moved to online focus groups since the pandemic, although obviously not exclusively, and then you do have to make that real additional effort to ensure that you are including people who are digitally excluded, whether they need additional support to attend those groups, or you need to do additional face-to-face research as well. And I think it's the same is true when it comes to generative AI and how we're using it. Yeah.
I think some of the real value, though, is so one of the things that I find really helpful is using tools that are able to look across social media data, looking at kind of big conversational narrative data, and looking at what already exists to allow you then to really target your primary research. So secondary data, using AI tools for secondary data analysis can then support more targeted and more inclusive primary research. I think there's probably a risk that if we just use the former, then we're missing the opportunity to add to the volume. Otherwise, it's largely just a question of understanding your biases in the same way that any method is biased, and to articulate them and not rely on one method. I'm a big fan of mixed methods.
Yeah, I think if I was to be really like risk averse and wary, I would be concerned maybe about de-skilling, and then you know, looking forward to the future, if there's too much reliance on some of these technologies, we might, as researchers, lose some of those skills of doing the more traditional research, which is more appropriate for people who are digitally excluded, and then that might become more expensive or just like less common.
I think there's real implications for the workforce as well. I'm conscious there was one more question.
Yeah.
Do you want to? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, we only have 3 seconds left, so that's grand. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.